everyone, and welcome to our latest edition of ELI on Air, the ELI Talks weekly interactive broadcast where we talk with interesting folks from across the Jewish spectrum about different ideas of Jewish engagement, literacy, and identity. My name is Miriam Berceau, and I am the program director of ELI Talks, and I am really thrilled to be sitting here at our virtual table today with Rabbi Geoffrey Mitelman, who is the founder of Sinai and Synapses, a really interesting organization that I hope that you will check out. And we are talking today about the science of Jewish identity. And we will be taking your questions throughout this entire conversation, so feel free to submit those right here through YouTube, or we will be keeping track also of the Twitter conversation. Use hashtag ELI Talks to submit your questions there. But without further ado, I'm going to let Rabbi Mitelman take it away and do a little introduction for us about what is identity. What is it that we are actually talking about today?
Thank you, Miriam. It's good to be able to be here. Thank you very much. I'm very excited to be here online. And it's wonderful to be able to talk about at least the relationship of science and religion, science and Judaism, and the way that science impacts Judaism and how we can bring the best of both of them together to be able to inform who we are. So I want to be able to start, we were talking about the science of Jewish identity. And one of the things that actually I want to start with is that we may have actually even mislabeled this a little bit, because I think that the word identity, singular, is a little bit of a misnomer. We don't have one identity. At least a lot of the research suggests that the more accurate term would be identities. We bring our sense of identity based on the relationship that we're in, the context that we're with. So, for example, I'm a rabbi, I'm a father, I'm a crossword solver, I've been a Yankees fan since I was 7, and those different elements of my identity come to the forefront. They're really based and used on the context that I'm in. And in fact, that makes a lot of sense evolutionarily. The purpose of our life, at least in terms of evolutionary perspective, is simply to survive long enough to pass our genes on to the next generation. But different roles in our evolutionary history were needed at different times. A great example of this, for example, is the tension between being a protector versus being a provider. So a protector, for example, had to protect themselves, they had to protect their family, be safe, don't take too many risks. That really was the job of the protector. But the flip side of that is that if you didn't do any protection, if you didn't do any risks, if you didn't try to provide for your family, if you didn't try to take down the mastodon, if you didn't try all the different fruits or berries that were in there, you weren't going to be able to find enough of the resources and the food to be able to survive in the next generation. So there's a distinction between the protector and the provider. The different identities there would come to the forefront based on what was needed at a given time. There's an idea called the modular mind. We actually have not one sense of self, but multiple modular subselves, and they're often in competition with each other. So the idea of identity isn't necessarily as accurate as a sense of identities. And our sense of identity is really created based on the actions that we take in a given moment. Our sense of identity and our behavior really reinforce each other. Who we are is very much based on what we do. And that has actually a lot of implications, I think, for Jewish identity. We talk a lot about how do we create Jewish identity for our kids, how do we create a sense of Jewish identity for the future. And I think that's actually maybe even the wrong question to ask, because you create identity, I think the analogy that I like is the sense of creating happiness. No one ever says, okay, I want to be happy, now I'm happy. The way that you become happy is you take actions, and the result of the actions that you're taking, you end up feeling happier. You create that sense of happiness inside of yourself. The parallel is a sense of Jewish identity. You can't just say, I want to create someone to have Jewish identity, I want to make sure the Jewish identity is strong, okay, now they have a sense of Jewish identity. It's a lot of actions that they have to take, whether that's acts of tikkun olam, whether that's Torah study, whether that's prayer, whether that's a sense of community. The sense of relationship is very important for a sense of identity. We can talk a little bit more about that. So the sense of identity really is much more the actions that we take and the actions that we take in a given context. So really the science of Jewish identity is much more about the science of Jewish identities, or how our Jewish identity is in relationship to all other sense of identities that float around in our brains and who we are.
Great. So Rabbi Mitelman, we're getting kind of a wacky little echo reverberation going on. So if you do have a pair of earbuds that you can slip in, that might actually help with that a little bit. If not, I'm just going to ask you to mute yourself briefly when you're not speaking, and I will do the same.
Okay.
So,
yes.
Excellent. So with that, it sounds like maybe our ills have been fixed since.
Yes.
So it's a really helpful framing and a really useful introduction for us, I think. So can you tell me a little bit about, it seems like something that's very important for the construction of identity, and maybe I'm not even using the right phrase there, but both this relational piece, but then also the issue of memory. So could you talk a little bit about how the relational aspect of identity and the memory aspect of identity kind of play into how we form our Jewish selves?
Absolutely, sure. Memory is a very interesting piece. There's a wonderful perspective that there's a wonderful question. It's a great philosophical question, which is, if you lost all your memories, would you still be you? And I think a lot of people would say the answer is no about that. And what's interesting about memory, there are actually a variety of different elements of memory, and researchers talk about a few different types of memory. One they call procedural memory, which is how do you do things. I have a 7.5-month daughter. She's learning how to walk. She's going to remember how to be able to do that. That's not as important for our elements. One is called semantic memory, and that's the facts that we have in our brain. So if we were to ask, can you remember what 5 times 4 is? You could get that immediately. That's actually very helpful if you're ever on Jeopardy. But the most interesting element is what's called episodic memory. Now, semantic memory is retrieved. You ask, what's 5 times 4, and it goes back into your brain. Episodic memory is an episode in your brain. So if I were to ask you to say, think about the Passover Seder that you were with last year. That actually, if you think back and remember Passover of this last year, that feels different than trying to remember what 5 times 4 feels like. And the reason is because semantic memory is retrieved, episodic memory is reconstructed. It becomes a story that we tell about ourselves. And if you think back on Passover of this last year, or even more importantly, all the Pesach celebrations that you had since you were growing up, that creates more and more sense of identity. The more stories that are told about who you are, the more you can reconstruct that sense of identity, the stronger that sense of identity is. The more ways that we can use memory, the way that we use memory is what you remember is actually what you tend to think about the most. So if you're spending a lot of time thinking about Pesach, if you're thinking about different Jewish activities, it creates not only a sense of memory, the memories then build on each other to create that sense of identity there. So memory and identity, I think the best way to be able to describe it is that identity is really a story. Memory is also a story. Memory is not history. Memory is not something that's necessarily designed to be accurate. Memory is designed to be able to inform who we are, give us lessons for today. That sense of identity also has that same element of it, that the sense of memory, the sense of identity is the story we tell about ourselves. And the way that we can tell that story, whether that's edited, whether that's sometimes changed a little bit, one of the hallmarks of both memory and identity is that they can be edited, they can be changed as need be. And different people are going to have different stories about what happened, but the sense of memory really builds into that sense of identity there.
I keep thinking about Philip K. Dick stories and replacing memories and implanting memories and all of these things. I learned a little while ago that the most oft repeated phrase in the Torah is "Remember that you were slaves in the land of Egypt," right. And which is a really significant moment in our collective history. But I personally was not a slave in the land of Egypt, although I'm commanded to remember that and feel as if I were. So what would you say that the Torah is asking us to do in repeating that and in sort of implanting that memory?
So there are a couple of different pieces of that. That's a great question. There are two elements of that. One is that memory is really not designed to be about the past. Memory is really designed about bringing the past into the present or the future. So remembering that we were slaves in the land of Egypt, the purpose isn't to go, that's interesting. Like, that doesn't do anything there. The purpose of remembering that we were slaves in the land of Egypt is to impact the way we're acting here and now. One of the wonderful lines, there's a professor named Steve Jordans who once said that when we remember something, or remember a person actually too, Kaddish is a wonderful way to think about this, or Yahrzeit. When we remember someone, his phrase is that we breathe a little life into it. And so when we remember that we were slaves in the land of Egypt, we're actually breathing a little bit of life into that value. We're actually trying to make sure that we bring that into ourselves. So the first element is that memory is really about how do we bring the past into the present or the future. If you think about all the different things that Judaism commands us to remember, that's, whether that's Shabbat, whether that's Amalek, whether that's that we were slaves in the land of Egypt, if you remember everything that Judaism commands you to do, you would be living a very full Jewish life. You would be having a sense, that would really form your sense of identity if you remembered to do all the different things that Judaism commands us to do. So the first piece is remembering the past to be able to bring it into the present and the future. The other was actually a piece I wrote a year ago that one of the words that is in that line of remember, everyone should act as if they were slaves in the land of Egypt. And the two words that we often sort of gloss over, but I would argue are the most important words, are as if, ke'ilu. There's actually a great book by a psychologist named Richard Wiseman who called it the as if principle. And the idea is that if you act as if you are a certain type of person, you become that type of person. So if you wanted to be a kind person, you actually do kind actions, and then that reinforces your sense of identity as a kind person. Identity doesn't always come from the inside out. Identity often comes from the outside in. How we act, we go, I was a nice person. I helped that person out. I actually really enjoyed doing that study of Talmud. So when we think of the as-if piece, if we act as if we were slaves in the land of Egypt, we place ourselves in the shoes of the Israelites, which then say, okay, now the Israelites acted in a certain kind of way to be able to recognize that we were strangers, to be able to open up our arms to other people. When we remember that as-if piece of it, that actually brings us into the here and now and allows us to translate stories, texts into our lives in that kind of way. When we actually live as if we were slaves in the land of Egypt and then act as if we are free, it changes the way we view ourselves and changes the way we act in this world.
So can we talk a bit about the difference between identity and labeling? Because it seems like the way that you're speaking about identity is in a really dynamic way, that it's
right.
This fluid, changing thing that depends on circumstance and context and history and experience and all of these things. And labeling something, saying you are a slave versus you should act as if you were a slave, feels very different. There's something more static about labeling. Could you just speak to that for a moment?
Sure. Yeah. That's a real tension of labeling versus identity. Labeling often pigeonholes people. So there's a great little piece of research from a woman named Carol Dweck, which I highly recommend people read the book Mindset by Carol Dweck. And she talks about the difference between a fixed mindset and a growth mindset. And some of you may have known this study that she did of looking at different students. And the students, they started with all the different students, and they gave them a very easy math test. And most of the students got on average about 8 out of 10 right. And half of the students, they said, boy, you got 8 out of 10 right. You're so smart. And the other kids said, boy, you got 8 out of 10 right. You must have worked very hard. They then gave those kids a much harder test. And what happened was the kids who were told you were so smart, first of all, gave up a lot sooner, and second of all, got a lot fewer right. They did not do as well on the harder test. The kids who were told, boy, you must have worked very hard, spent a longer time, they were more invested in trying to solve the problems, and they got more correct. So the idea of labeling people, of you are a smart person, actually can really be very, very challenging, very, very dangerous in that kind of way. Because then the sense of identity of I'm a smart person, well, hold on a second, if I'm not able to get this question right, well then am I really a smart person? It really can create an existential crisis for 13-year-olds, which we don't want to be able to do. So for example, when I'm working with bar and bat mitzvah kids, I always make sure, boy, you've clearly been working very hard. I'm really proud of you. You've really invested a lot of your time and energy in that kind of way. Because with all, certainly, for example, with bar and bat mitzvah, some kids are more musical, some are less. Some Hebrew's very easy for them, some Hebrew's a little bit more challenging. So being able to say, boy, you must have worked very hard, instead of labeling them as you are a smart person, that's a very important distinction to be able to make. The one sort of wrinkle to that, there was an article in the New York Times about a month ago by a guy named Adam Grant, who wrote a great book called Give and Take, that actually, for kids who are about 8 or 9 years old, that if they are labeled in a positive kind of way, that's actually a positive for them. So if they do something really nice and the kid is told, boy, you must be a very kind person, that helps them. That actually is, at least the research says, the way to be able to go at this point, in large part because at 8 and 9 years old is when they are forming their sense of moral identity. A little too young, a little too old, it doesn't have that same impact. But at about 8, 9, 10 years old, as kids are developing their sense of moral identity, which again has significant implications for when we're teaching our 3rd and 4th and 5th and 6th graders about how do we do acts of gimilut chasadim, how do we do acts of tikkun olam, being able to really use that sense of identity as a kind person, as a caring person. The research says that's actually potentially the way to go.
So as you're saying this, what I'm thinking of is how often so many of us who are either watching this video now live or later on hear this term thrown around, bad Jew.
Right.
That I'm a bad Jew, I don't do X, Y, or Z. So what do you do with that? Where does that come from when people are sort of labeling themselves and building that into their own identities? And where do you go with that?
That's a great question, and I think the first thing that I would ask people if they say I'm a bad Jew, I would say, well, what do you mean by that? How are that? Because I think it's important of how do people self-identify? How do people self-identify? And I think a lot of it actually goes back to the context there, because if someone says I'm a bad Jew, I hear that a lot as a rabbi. I think because they're expecting the rabbi to be able to sort of scold them in that kind of way, or sometimes people wear it as a badge of honor in that kind of way. But I think generally people, I don't know, but I would think that people tend not to use that phrase when they're just talking with themselves, talking among with each other. So if someone says I'm a bad Jew, I would ask, what do they mean by that? And I would try to then spin that and try to be able to find out, are there particular, again, actions or behaviors that resonate with them? Because one of the different interesting things, because the sense of fluid identity, and especially when it's a broad sense of identity, you can define that in a variety of different ways. So, for example, if someone asks themselves, "Are you a good driver?" Most people are going to say, "Yes, I'm a good driver." But that doesn't. But that's because they define themselves as, well, I always merge. But they may go 90 or 95 miles an hour. They forget that that's part of their identity too, and they focus only on the one element of that. So if you do a broad enough definition of saying, are you a good driver? Are you a good person in that kind of way? People will focus on their one element that's good and ignore the other elements of that. And I think that parallels with what does it mean to be a good Jew or a bad Jew. I think that it's such a broad spectrum that we can actually find ways to be able to say, if people say I'm a bad Jew, to be able to say, okay, there may be things that you're not doing, which is look, there are all sorts of Jewish activities that I don't do. I don't identify myself as a bad Jew. How do you spin that? How do you find, okay, where are the Jewish activities, the Jewish elements that resonate with you, and spin that to be able to find a sense of pride in what they are, what they do take pride in, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. And so in thinking about identity formation, so we have this phrase in Judaism, na'aseh v'nishma, right? Do and then understand, or however you kind of want to parse that. And that seems to work well alongside cognitive psychology and the way we actually sort of go about our lives. But at the same time, I've heard from different people about, changing the way you think about things can also change your behavior. And so it seems like this sort of this cyclical kind of process. So where do you start with building Jewish identity? Is it with behavior? Is it with thought? Is it some combination?
I would say, I would argue that we would start with behavior. We start with behavior and then move to the cognitive element of it for a variety of different reasons. Actually, I think I would start with behavior, emotion, thinking as the basis on that. For a huge variety of reasons. The behavior actually, again, from an evolutionary point of view, the bodily functions that we have are much more deeply ingrained in our evolutionary history than our higher cognitive functions there. So if there's something that's walking or dancing or moving around or smelling, I mean, that's one of the wonderful things about, for example, Havdalah. I don't know anyone who doesn't love Havdalah. Everyone loves Havdalah. And what's great about Havdalah is that Havdalah actually hits all five of our senses. Because you often people have their arms around each other, and so there's something physical there. And then we're singing, so it's something auditory. And you see the flame, and so it's visual. And you taste the wine, so there's taste there. And then you smell the spices. Smell is actually one of the most primal senses there. Mm-hmm. And actually, there's a lot of research. The big phrase is called multiple avenues of encoding. The more ways you can try to get people connected, the stronger the connection's going to be. So that's why, for example, Passover always has it. I know Passover's coming when I smell different things. If I ever eat horseradish in October, I think of Passover there. So you start with different types of behavior because that actually automatically, instantly gets people connected in that kind of way. The emotional piece of it, that's the next level higher up. And I think one of the wonderful things about, for example, creating a sense of the Jewish identity is that a positive emotion is actually going to spark people and keep them excited. So getting people emotionally connected in a positive kind of way, that's the next level up. And then the cognitive element, that's something that is actually relatively easy. People can find information in any different kinds of ways that they would want to be able to find out. The cognitive element is actually the least important piece. And I think what's actually going to be the most effective is if all three levels are consonant with each other. If the behavior is consonant with the emotion that it's designed to elicit with a cognitive element of it, it's incredibly powerful there. So, and the other very simple reason that I would say that we start with behavior and let behavior form identity is that it's actually an easier entree point. You can get someone to do something a lot more easily than you can get them to think something. So it's a lot easier to be able to get people to do things than to reflect on who am I in this crazy world that we live in. It's a lot easier to get them to do a particular program or to be able to do something in part of the community, and then to be able to use that to inform that sense of identity.
So I'm thinking of, as you're saying this, I'm thinking of a couple of things. First is the this says a lot about why Jewish food, I think, is so important, because
yeah, it's hugely
it
important. Yeah.
speaks to that primal part of us. It involves every single sense, and it certainly has those layers of emotion, and probably sparks certain thoughts. And so I feel like it's something that really acts on all of those levels. So if you'd like to say anything to that, but I'm also thinking about, with this idea of getting people to do something is much easier than getting them to think differently. I'm also bringing up the trope of Chabad, right?
Mm-hmm.
And getting young men to lay tefillin and doing it on the street corner and just making it happen. So could you speak to that a bit as well?
Sure. I mean, I think that's one of the wonderful things about Judaism is that the rituals are very, very physical. And I think whether that is laying tefillin, and I think that's one of the, I think there are a variety of reasons that Chabad is successful, and I think that's one of them. That it makes people, it's a very low barrier, and I think that's very important. I think to be able to find the phrase that I like to use is you want to have a low barrier and a high bar. You want to make sure that the entry point is very easy, but you want to create something outstanding. And I think to be able to meet both of those is a very important element. I mean, you talk about the importance of food, and it's huge. It's huge, and I think that's, again, it's the multiple avenues of encoding there. One of the other examples, great examples there, is basically every single holiday, whether that's Hanukkah, whether that's Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, whether that's Shavuot. There's always something that is auditory. There's something that's gustatory. There's something that's very much about food in that kind of way that has specific kinds of foods there. And I think there's something, if you think, for example, of Kol Nidre, it's a wonderful example. I think the vast majority of Jews, including me, a lot of the time, each year I have to look back. I'm like, right, what's the words about Kol Nidre? Like, I have to look at that again. And then to be able to say, wait, this is what's so powerful. You tell lay people or the wider Jewish world, Kol Nidre is this dry Aramaic legal text, and they're sort of like, wait, what? Because the purpose of Kol Nidre, yes, it's the purpose about the words, but it's a couple of different pieces. It's the music that's there, and it's also that's what I've done every year since I was 3. And the more that's created, the more it's a sense of identity there.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. So I want to get back to there's this kind of meme, I guess, going around the Jewish community about relational Judaism, and a term coined by Ron Wolfson in his book of the same title. And there are all kinds of initiatives that feel very similar. We did an ELI on Air with Rabbi Arnie Samlin a little while ago about this idea of connectedness kind of being the heart of Jewish education. Yep. And so I'd love to hear from you about the role of a little bit more about this role of relationships, and maybe let's touch on the idea of kind of collective identity in addition to individual identity.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that humans, as we evolved, we did not evolve as isolated individuals. In fact, there's a lot of research. I think it's pretty much the scientific consensus that the reason our brains are so big is to be able to remember all the social relationships that we've had, and that's why it's grown. That the idea that you need to be able to remember, who helped me last month when I needed to be able to find some food, and who stiffed me when I asked them for help. So we are very much moral creatures. But the interesting piece and the challenging piece, there's a researcher named Jonathan Haidt who wrote a great book called The Righteous Mind, Why Good People Are Divided by Politics and Religion. And one of the things that he talks about is that morality, as he said, it binds and it blinds. So we very much as humans create a sense of us and them. We can't avoid that. We always have a sense of who we are, our in-group, and the out-group. and the in-group is good, and the out-group is bad, which, again, on the African savannah made perfect sense because we were about 100, 150 people in our tribes, and you never met anyone else. Today in 2014, that's not going to be as helpful because we live in this global world. But a sense of collective identity, to be able to find who is on my team, who is part of my in-group, really is a very valuable skill. I'm going to play on that in 1 second because I want to expand on that a little bit. There's a lot of research that actually says if you find a point of similarity, you're going to be more connected with them, more compassionate to them, more related to them, more willing to help. So there's a lot of research that says that actually the easiest way to create compassion in others is to find a sense of connectedness there. So now, because we live with this in-group, out-group, and because it's so important to find that sense of in-group, that could lead us down a very dangerous path. So I want to give a little caveat. The way I started is that we actually have multiple senses of identities. So if you are trying to create a sense of collective identity, you've got to be able to change the different hats that you have to be able to find that sense of connection there. So one of the things I said at the beginning, I'm a big Yankees fan. I lived in Boston for a year. I did not get a whole lot of friendly smiles when I would wear my Yankees hat. There was a real sense of tension there because they were the in-group, I was the out-group. But when I went to a Reform synagogue there, the Yankee-Red Sox rivalry didn't matter so much because I was part of this community there. So the question is, how do we find a sense of our in-group that can also change based on the context that we need to be in at a given time? So a sense of collective identity, one of those senses of collective identity is the sense of Jewish identity. That is a piece of it. How do we help people connect to the in-group that is the Jewish community here, and at the same time, how do we shift our hats if we need to be able to say, well, this is the local community that I live in the town that I live in. How do I find the people who are my age? How do we find the people who have children of my same age? How do I find the people who all sorts of different elements of the identity being fluid based on the context there.
Mm-hmm. So what would so tell me a little bit about the implications for this for folks who are interested in instilling a notion of quote unquote a strong Jewish identity in children or in the community. What should Jewish institutions, what should parents of Jewish children, what should we know that we don't, and what's sort of the one insight that you feel like we need to take away that we're not necessarily acting on or thinking about right now?
So I would say the big argument I would say is if we want to create a sense of Jewish identity, we shouldn't focus on creating Jewish identity. Instead, we should be focused on the behaviors and giving kids the opportunity and people the opportunity to form their own sense of identity. There a few years ago, actually, there was a really interesting piece, and maybe you remember this a few years ago, where the horoscopes changed, where people, they changed what their horoscopes were, and I don't believe in horoscopes at all. Most of my friends on Facebook don't buy into horoscope, but there was such an uproar. Wait a second, I'm not a Libra, I'm a Leo. What are you talking about? And it became this sort of outrage. And I think the outrage was because people were trying to force a sense of identity onto another person. So the more you say this is who you are or who you should be, it's actually going to push people back. And so the more you say this is who you should be, I think the less likely it's going to be able to create that sense of Jewish identity. But the more that we give people an opportunity for each individual child to say, this is who I am, this is how I express myself as a Jew, that is actually going to be different from child to child. Because again, this definition of good Jew, bad Jew, what does it mean to be a Jew? Even the sense of Jewish identity is a misnomer. It's Jewish identities, so that can manifest itself again in a variety of different ways. Giving a variety of kids a variety of different options and opportunities to start with behavior, then for the behavior to be layered upon that of illicit types of emotions, and then the top part is the cognitive element of that. That's actually going to be a natural flowering of a sense of Jewish identity, rather than this geschrei of how are we going to create a sense of Jewish identity. That's going to come naturally. That's got to come sort of out of its own sense of who those kids are. So that would be my argument there.
Are there behaviors that that we should be encouraging more at different ages?
Yeah, I think again it's very important to be age appropriate. I think kids their cognitive styles and their emotional styles changes as they grow up. I think that it's very important to be very tactile for young kids, and for them to be able to find the joy in Judaism. One of the things that I like to tend to say is that I'm not interested in making people more Jewish, and I'm not interested in making more Jews. I'm interested in being able to let Judaism be a technology and tools to be able to help people become better human beings. So certainly with very young kids, to be able to talk about, do very tactile elements of this. When it comes to 7th, 8th, 9th grade, that's really when kids are forming their sense of identity. That's when their God concept is really starting to change. I like to say, if you show me an 8th or a 9th grader, I will show you an atheist. And it's because that their view on God, which was great when they were 7 or 8 or 9, doesn't work when they're 13, 14, 15. So being able to re-encapsulate what is their sense of God. There's a great line that I love. I think it's from Laura Geller, but it may be from someone else, who says that all theology is autobiography. If we help kids understand who they are, it also helps them understand their relationship with God. So I think that's a very important piece of that. Again, it's really trying to be able to find the Naaseh v'nishma and start with the behavior and build upon that. And the one extra thing that I would say, I'm going to make a little plug. Miriam, we were both at the Jewish Futures Conference yesterday, and there's a blog, and actually I had a blog post on the Jewish Futures Conference called "Why Judaism Needs Velcro." And one of the things that's great about Velcro is very sticky. If you think about Velcro, it stays for a long time. And how does Velcro stay? Why does Velcro stay? Well, there's the soft side, and then there's the hooks. And without any hooks, the soft side just sort of slides down. If you've ever tried to put the soft side of the Velcro, it doesn't do anything. But if there are enough hooks, the Velcro stays, and it stays for a really long time. I tend to view Judaism and Jewish education very much as the soft side of the Velcro. I think too often we give kids all this information, and if you think about it, it just sort of slides right down their head. Where we've got to focus is, where are the hooks that the kids have in their own heads? What are kids grappling with in their own lives? What are they excited about? What are they passionate about? Finding out what, again, it comes back to the relational Judaism. You got to find out who your audience is. And if you are able to start with what the hooks are in the kids, then the soft side of the Velcro hooks on, and it stays for a really, really long time. And it creates that sense of identity that's going to grow and develop as kids get older.
A cool metaphor.
Thank you.
Can you talk for just a moment? I'm curious about text study.
Yeah.
Because it feels like that is often the entry point for a lot of organizations, to get folks more excited or more involved in Jewish life. And on the one hand, yes, it's an activity, it's a behavior, but on the other hand, it feels very cerebral. So could you just speak to that for a moment?
Sure. So text study is great when it works and can be deadly if it doesn't. And I want to actually give a hopefully a practical suggestion for those who teach text and what the barrier tends to be on that. The Velcro theory, actually, I'm quoting from one of my favorite books called Made to Stick by Dan and Chip Heath. If you haven't read it, I'm going to say to everyone, go out, buy that book. It is the best.
It's a good one.
Have you read it?
Yeah.
So one of the things, the way it starts with is this a study about people who are tappers and listeners. And what they did is they divided everyone into groups of into pairs. In the pair, one person was a tapper and the other was the listener. And the tapper was supposed to tap out a list of songs. And they asked the tapper, can you guess how many songs the listener is going to be able to get right? And the tapper thought the listener would get about 50% right. And in fact, the listener got about 2% of them correct. Because the tapper knew what they were trying to do. The tapper had the song going in their head, and the listener had no idea what was going on. And what these authors, Dan and Chip Heath, talk about, they call about the curse of knowledge. And the people who are teaching know, and the people who are learning don't. And they assume that the people who don't know already know everything that the teacher knows. And I think the curse of knowledge is really, really important in terms of being aware of in terms of text study. Because when you're preparing a piece of Talmud, you've got to know it, you've got to know all the context, you know a lot, and by the time you present it, you've forgotten that you don't know everything. And so I think it's really important in terms of text study to be able to, first of all, realize what are the learners not going to know? Where do you need to start? You need to start with not with what the learners know, but start with what they don't know. And the other piece of it too, again, if it's cognitive, if it's up here, it's got to at least be connected with the emotional element too. So one of my favorite lines, there's someone who wanted to study to be a rabbi and said to the rabbi, I've been through the Talmud 7 times. And the rabbi said, but how many times has the Talmud been through you? And I think it's really important if you're teaching text, if you're teaching Talmud, that it's not just about text study, but it's about how does the text inform who we are as Jews, and maybe even more importantly, how does the text help us figure out who we are as individuals?
Mm-hmm. Whew. Beautiful. I love it. I understand you have an exciting event coming up next week. You want to tell us 2 words about that before we close out?
Sure. Maybe a couple more words than 2. But so Sinai and Synapses it's a new organization to be able to bridge the scientific and religious worlds, very much like what we did today. How do we use the best of science and the best of religion? I would encourage people to go to sinaiandsynapses.org. You can see more information there. A week from today at Central Synagogue, if you're in New York, at 55th and Lex, Sinai and Synapses and Central Synagogue are presenting a program called Can Science and Religion Coexist? I'm going to be moderating a discussion among 3 really fantastic people, Rabbi Brad Hirschfield, who is the president of CLAL, Michael Zimmerman, who is the founder of the Clergy Letter Project. He's a biologist in Washington State. Wanted to see, could he get some Christian clergy to sign a public document that says evolution's not a theory, it's a fact. He got 13,000 Christian clergy, 500 rabbis to be able to sign that. And the third person is Professor Hank Davis, who is an atheist evolutionary psychologist, wrote a great book called Caveman Logic. And he is a very funny, very dynamic speaker. And I'm going to be moderating a discussion among the 3 of them. It's May 29th at 7 p.m. at Central Synagogue. The information is again on Sinai and Synapses website, and I hope to see everyone there.
Awesome. That is the end of our time. I can only assume that everyone has taken away. I don't know what you don't know, but I feel emotional. I feel very enriched by this conversation. I hope everyone else does as well. Thank you to Rabbi Mitelman, Sinai and Synapses for a really interesting window into how Jewish identity develops. I hope we all got something to take away from it. So next week, we'll have another ELI on air for you with more cool folks talking about interesting ideas around engagement, literacy, and identity. We'll actually be talking with Jack Wertheimer and others about a study into Israel in Jewish day schools and what are some of the roles and perceptions that are happening in that area. So it should be a very interesting discussion. And we'll be here every week having these kinds of conversations. Thank you all for joining us. Thank you to Rabbi Mitelman for sharing your time and your talent. And we look forward to continuing the discussion online. Bye, everybody. See you on air.
Bye-bye.